Hello, my name's Andrew Blick. I'm head of the Department of Political Economy, King's College London. We're the only department of its type in the UK. And we're actually entering our 10th anniversary this year. And we're trying to hold a series of events in the changed circumstances of the time where we talk about different aspects of the kind of things we're interested in here in the Department of Political Economy. Now, today I'm very lucky to have Professor Vernon Bogdanor, Professor of Government here at King's, and he's a leading constitutional expert in the United Kingdom. I'm sure I don't need to introduce him to the people viewing this video. He's actually got a new book which was published on the 22nd of September, so that's last week at the time of recording. It's published by Yale University Press, and it's called Britain and Europe in a Troubled World. It comes from a lecture series, I believe, that Vernon gave last year, the Henry L. Stimson lecture series, which takes place at Yale University. First of all, Vernon's going to talk about his book to us, tell us about the contents of the book, what the ideas lying behind it. Then I'm actually going to put some questions to him, which came out of a workshop I had with students on my Democracy in the United Kingdom module, which is part of the MA program we offer here at the Department of Political Economy. So Vernon, if I can hand over to you and you can tell us all about your book, please.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks to King's for allowing me to hold forth. There are a number of themes in the book, but let me concentrate today on just two questions which the book seeks to answer. The first is, why has Britain's relationship with the continent been so ambivalent for so long? And the reasons, in my view, lie deep in history. And the second is, was Brexit an aberration, or does it reveal real weaknesses in the EU itself? Now, dealing with the first, that we've had an ambivalent relationship with the continent, I don't think anyone will really doubt. And it's very apparent even in the way we talk. We speak of entering Europe or leaving Europe, and what we mean is the continent. Because, of course, geographically, we are part of Europe. But are we politically part of Europe? Or are we, as Winston Churchill often said, in Europe, but not of it? Now, our imperial past represents a very short period of our history, comparatively speaking. But it's had the effect of pulling us away from the continent. And we formed, as a result, habits of mind quite different from the continental powers, as well as distinctive political and trading relations. And many people are familiar with John of Gaunt's words from Shakespeare's Richard II about Britain. This fortress, built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war. And the infection, presumably, came from the continent. Now, let me take a historical example. In 1938, at the time of the Munich Agreement, we faced war over Hitler's demand for the incorporation of the German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia into the Reich. And Neville Chamberlain made a speech on the radio when we seemed to be very near a war. He said, "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." Now, he's been much criticised for this, but perhaps he did express the sentiments of the British people. But the British people would not have regarded Australia, Canada, and New Zealand as faraway countries, even though, of course, geographically, they're much further away from Czechoslovakia. And today, there are more British people living in Australia than in all the EU member states put together. But of course, both in 1914 and 1939, we found ourselves at war as a result of what was happening on the continent in faraway countries, if you like, Serbia in 1914 and Poland in 1939. And we weren't at war because of the empire. So our fate has always been intertwined with that of the continent, but not wholly intertwined, because the main events which have stamped our consciousness are events that occurred when we were alone confronting a hostile continent. Napoleon in the early 19th century, and then Hitler in 1940, when our troops were successfully evacuated from Dunkirk. But it's a measure of our reluctance to involve ourselves in the continent that the evacuation at Dunkirk was so widely seen not as a defeat, but a triumph. And after the fall of France, George VI wrote to his mother, "Personally, I feel happier now that we have no allies to be polite to and pamper." And the king's official biographer said, in these sentiments, he was at one with the vast majority of his subjects. And 1940 seemed to show that Britain did not stand or fall as a nation with the other nations of the continent. Britain, unlike them, could survive a military defeat, withdrawing her troops and continuing the fight. And the outcome of the war, of course, further emphasized the difference between Britain and the continent, because Britain alone among the European powers, except for Russia, which was a part European power, was a victor in the war. Furthermore, Britain was the only one of the European combatants which had neither been ruled by a fascist or Nazi government, nor been invaded and occupied by the Nazi or fascist powers. So the continental powers had to start again and come to terms with the experience of fascism, Nazism, or collaboration. To put the point crudely, young people on the continent had to ask themselves whether they could be proud of what their parents or grandparents had done during the war, or whether shame was a more appropriate reaction. Being European, the political scientist from Bulgaria, Ivan Krastev, has said, is about being aware of what we did. And the sense of being European, it has been said, was a state of mind born of defeat, occupation, and the gulf between those who collaborated and those who resisted. Britain did not share that state of mind. Through the accident of geography, the British could be proud, not ashamed of their part in the war. So Brexit was not an accident. It followed from very deep-seated and ingrained British attitudes. Could these attitudes be changed? France's President de Gaulle thought not, at least not for a long time. When in January 1963, he vetoed Britain's first attempt to enter the European communities, he said that the Treaty of Rome, which established the communities, had been signed in 1957 by 6 continental states, which were of the same nature. Britain, by contrast, was insular. She is maritime. She is linked through her exchanges, her markets, her supply lines, to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities and only slight agricultural ones. And that was why she was so opposed to the common agricultural policy, which the French regarded as an essential element of the community. De Gaulle concluded that the nature, the structure, the very situation, the conjuncture that are England's differ profoundly from those of the continentals. He did admittedly accept that Britain might evolve, quote, little by little towards the continent, and he concluded by saying if that happened, no one would be more pleased than France, but that perhaps was not wholly sincere. Now, de Gaulle's successor to the French presidency, Georges Pompidou, took a different view. He thought that British attitudes could change. When in 1971, British Prime Minister Edward Heath was making a successful attempt to secure entry into the European communities, Pompidou gave a television interview in which he said he'd asked Heath whether Britain had really decided to become European, whether, and I quote, Britain, which is an island, had decided to moor herself to the continent, and if she was therefore ready to come in from the wide seas which had always drawn her. And he said that Heath's response had convinced him that his views were in line, and I quote, with France's own conception of Europe. But did Edward Heath's answer correspond with the concept of the future of Europe held by the British people? We joined in 1973, but we did not share the ethos of Europe. Now, Robert Schuman, France's foreign minister in the late 1940s, when the first steps towards European unity were taken, declared that countries of the continent had a destiny shared in common. And that is why they were prepared to surrender some of their powers to a European supranational institution. But Britain did not share that sense of a destiny shared in common. That is why all British governments would have preferred an intergovernmental community. We joined in part because we had run out of other options. The special relationship with the US was shown to be illusory after Suez. The Commonwealth was clearly not a power grouping. And because we believed, mistakenly I suspect, that the EU could help us resolve our economic problems and raise the rate of economic growth. Those, and I include myself, who hoped that Europe would remain in the European Union, also hoped, like Edward Heath, that Georges Pompidou was right and that we could transform long-held attitudes. Like Edward Heath, we did not succeed. Now, the second question which the book seeks to answer is whether Brexit was a peculiarly British aberration or whether it reflects anxieties which are also held elsewhere. Now, in early 2018, President Macron of France was honest enough to confess in a BBC interview that he could not guarantee that a referendum in France would not yield the same results as in Britain. And Donald Tusk, the former president of the European Council, declared in 2016, "It would be a fatal error to assume that the negative result in the UK referendum represents a specifically British issue. The Brexit vote is a desperate attempt to answer the questions that millions of Europeans ask themselves daily. And Brexit challenges what might be called the ideology of Europe. For after all, it's a serious matter for a democratic organisation when a major member state decides to leave. How should the EU respond?" Now, the EU is a difficult organisation to understand. The former American Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, has said that to understand the EU, you have to be either a genius or French. Now, I am neither, but I shall do my best. Now, the Italian political scientist Sergio Fabrini has called the EU a compound democracy, like America, with a separation of powers at two levels: territorially, between a federal government or supreme government and lower level units, and at the centre, between the executive, legislature and court. But there's a vital difference between the EU and America, and that is the role of the European Commission, which is not elected, but is given the sole power of legislative initiative. There's of course no parallel to the Commission in the United States or in Britain. Now, in countries influenced by the British parliamentary tradition, the power of legislative initiative is seen as a political power to be exercised only by those who are elected, not officials. In Britain, as in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, there's a fairly strict separation of powers by means of which political power lies in the hands of those elected and accountable to Parliament and the people. Within Britain, the minimal exception of a very small number of ministers in the House of Lords. In countries influenced by the British parliamentary tradition, civil servants not being elected are non-partisan career officials. They serve whatever government is chosen by the voters. They cannot make political or legislative decisions. The British find it difficult to understand the continental conception of the unelected politician or the elected official. Now, many years ago, I heard a Conservative MP address a member of the Commission, the late Finn Gundelach, as an official. And Mr. Gundelach bristled. I suspect that Jacques Delors would have bristled even more at being called an official. But the British do not comprehend how a non-elected person can enjoy such wide powers as those wielded by Delors. The Commission has admittedly become weaker since the end of Delors' reign in 1995, because Delors was the most active president of the Commission that Europe has known. And there have been attempts to make it accountable through the so-called Spitzenkandidat, lead candidate process. And through this process, each party grouping in the European Parliament would nominate its candidate for president of the Commission before the European Party elections. Then, the party which won the most seats would have the right to have its candidate adopted as president. The outcome in 2014 was that Jean-Claude Juncker, the lead candidate of the European People's Party, the Christian Democrat grouping, became president of the Commission. Yet few in Europe had heard of Juncker before the election, and it is difficult to believe that those who voted for the European People's Party were conscious of supporting him for the post of Commission president. In 2019, Manfred Weber, leader of the European People's Party in the European Parliament, was the lead candidate, but in the event, Ursula von der Leyen was chosen as the Commission president. But few in Europe were very familiar with either of them. So the problem of the democratic deficit is unlikely to be resolved through this method. Now, the Commission admittedly needs the approval of the European Parliament before it takes office, but the European Parliament does not have the same relationship to the people of Europe that domestic legislatures have to their peoples. Most Europeans continue to give their primary allegiance to the legislatures of the member states, not the European Parliament, whose elections attract only a derisory turnout. People feel represented by their national parliaments, not the European Parliament. And indeed, election campaigns for the European Parliament are still run primarily by national parties. The European Parliament is often seen not as representing the European people, but the political class, not us, but them. It seems remote from those whom it seeks to represent. And as for the Commission, it is not only geographically remote, like the Parliament, it is also institutionally remote because it is not chosen by the people of Europe. It is inherently remote. It is seen even more than the Parliament as part of an alienated superstructure. Now, this remoteness is not an accident. It is, in a sense, inherent in the conception of European integration held by Jean Monnet, its founding father. Now, Monnet was a great man who understood that European unity could not be achieved by goodwill alone. That goodwill needed to be embodied in common policies and common institutions. But Monnet exercises influence from behind the scenes. He never in his life held any elected position. Perhaps it was for this reason that he never fully appreciated that political legitimacy is secured primarily by direct election, a principle fundamental to the British conception of parliamentary government. The epigraph to Monnet's memoirs declares, "We are not forming coalitions between states, but union among people." But the people he had in mind were the elites who would construct Europe by stealth, using economic means to lock nations together, with the people as a whole being almost unaware of the process until it had become irreversible. He hoped to achieve a united Europe without it being noticed by the people. Such a process might have been possible in the more deferential Europe of the 1950s, when the leaders led and the followers followed, an era when unelected officials enjoyed great prestige, but it's not possible in the Europe of today. And Monnet and other founding fathers actually envisaged the Commission as a provisional government of Europe, and eventually as a real government of Europe, with the European Parliament the lower house and the Council of Ministers representing the member states, an upper house analogous to the German upper house, the Bundesrat, which represents the governments of the various Länder. Now, that might have been feasible had Europe remained an organization comprising just 6 closely associated member states, as it was when it was founded in 1958, or if there were to be an inner core of just a few member states prepared to move rapidly forward to political integration, something envisaged by President Macron in a landmark speech charting the way forward for Europe delivered at the Sorbonne in September 2017. But it is utterly implausible in a sprawling EU of 27 states. Now, European integration, from the time of the coal and steel community to the European Union agreed at Maastricht in 1992, was developed by elites with little popular involvement. That was understandable. In the immediate post-war years, there was some distrust of the people, given the experience of mass support for fascism, Nazism, and collaboration. Besides, the aim was to create not merely European institutions, but to create from various national peoples a European people, a European allegiance which would be superimposed upon national allegiances. The founding fathers, President Macron declared in his Sorbonne speech, built Europe in isolation from the people because they were an enlightened vanguard. He then went on to say, European democratic doubt put an end to that chapter, and I think we were wrong to move Europe forward in spite of the people. We must stop being afraid of the people. We must stop simply building Europe in isolation from them. Now, the European Union then needs to confront the problem of the democratic deficit. And one way in which this can be achieved, as some French Gaullists have suggested, is by bringing the Commission under the control of the European Council, which represents the governments of the member states. The power to initiate legislation should be transferred from the Commission to the Council, which would then be seen to be the executive of the EU. The Commission would become a secretariat of the Council and would lose the power to initiate legislation. Such a reform would help to undermine Euroscepticism, which thrives on the anathema of an unelected and unaccountable legislative body, something that Britain in particular has found it difficult to understand or accept. But Europe also needs, as Donald Tusk has pointed out, not more Europe, but better Europe. Not more integration, but practical improvements, such as completion of the European services market. The services, after all, make up 70% of economic activity in the European Union, and a European digital market, which Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, has calculated would add 400 billion euros to Europe's GDP. So my book concludes that Brexit was not an aberration, either for Britain or for the European Union. So instead of applauding or condemning it, we must seek to learn its lessons, whether we favour Brexit or not. For after all, Brexit is yesterday's argument. And what better institution to help us learn the lessons than King's College London? I can't hear you. I can't hear.
Can you hear me now, Vernon?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Vernon. That's a fascinating overview of the book. One immediate question for me, and then I'm going to follow up with one question from a student, if that's okay, if you've got time for that. The question for me was, while the UK was a member of the EU, and as we know, we are no longer a member of it, whenever there were moves proposed to close the democratic deficit, to introduce more of an elected element into the way in which the governance of Europe was determined, the UK tended to oppose those measures. So a good example being, you referred to the episode when Juncker, admittedly not a household name, was the person who was chosen after the European election. We actually opposed that. We resisted it. So is there something of a tension there that although we objected to the democratic deficit, on the other hand, any moves that might be seen to end the deficit, but pointed perhaps in the direction of a more federal European system, we also opposed?
Well, we always took the view that Europe was not ready for further integration. Were we wrong? Have we not seen that some of the other revolts against it, which have led to the growth of populist parties in various European countries, are they not against that too? And we took the view, which may well have been right, that the best way to end the democratic deficit is to make the Commission more responsible to the Council and to get more scrutiny from national parliaments. In other words, Europe is bound to be a mixture, the intergovernmental and the supranational. But were we necessarily wrong in thinking the danger was the supranational element had gone too far? And when it took things away from national electorates, that was dangerous. For example, we hear a lot now about a European fiscal policy, European banking policy. If you take all these economic matters away from national parliaments, what is there left to discuss in general elections? It's all outside. And one of the problems that Britain faced with Europe was that we'd taken the power to decide immigration policy out of the hands of the British Parliament. And that's effect worried people, not just in Britain, but some other countries as well. And take another practical example. In the 1990s, John Major said Britain wasn't yet ready for the euro, and he was widely derided. Now, I wonder if the young people in Greece or Spain who are unemployed might, as a result, might not think, well, perhaps he was right. And might you say this, that paradoxically, the British Eurosceptics and the French Gaullists were to some extent in the vanguard of the European movement for this reason, that they appreciated, because of the historical experience of their countries, what the loss of national sovereignty meant in practice. Now, many of the other countries who didn't have such long parliamentary experience were happy to accept it rhetorically. For example, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, which came out of dictatorship, it was a badge of democracy. Similarly, with the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, the ex-communist countries, them too, it was a badge of democracy. And for Germany, it was a mean back to respectability. When you're faced with concrete issues of the loss of sovereignty, people begin to, for example, the Germans aren't keen on sharing economic policy with what they regard as the feckless countries of the Mediterranean. The Poles aren't necessarily keen on sharing decisions about abortion with other countries. And they were just as unhappy as Britain about the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And there are all sorts of other examples one can put forward. So it's easy to say rhetorically, yes, of course, we're happy to share power. But when it comes to concrete matters, and your electorate have lost the power to decide on certain issues, then doubts exist. And the danger of Europe in more recent years, I think since the law, has been going too fast for the people of Europe, particularly in the broader Europe of 27 states that now exists.
Okay, and this one now comes from the students I was speaking to earlier in the week, and it relates more to what might the relationship between the UK and the European Union be going forward, and specifically, we've currently got a bill going through Parliament, internal, which avowedly threatens to violate international law. Do you think that could lead to a long-lasting change in UK's relations with the outside world and with the European Union, or it'll be more of an ephemeral thing? What do you think is likely to be the consequences of that? Big question, I know, but...
Well, the students have asked a very good question. It's really two questions. And I'll deal with the internal market bill first. Now, it can never be right for a democracy like Britain to threaten to break international law or an international agreement, particularly when the ink on it is fairly dry. And I greatly fear that unless the government finds a way of getting off the hook, and I suspect they may be looking for a way to get off the hook, that this will reverberate in the EU for a considerable period of time. And also, something we sometimes forget, in America for a considerable period of time. And that matters even if Trump is re-elected. Some people have talked whether we get a good trade agreement in America depends on whether President Trump likes us or not. Now that is a misunderstanding of the American Constitution. Whether we get a trade deal, a good trade deal, depends on Congress, much more than President Trump. And the House of, whatever happens in the presidential election, the House of Representatives is almost certain to remain Democrat. And Nancy Pelosi, to put it mildly, is not a great admirer of the internal market bill. And the further point about that bill, which is it drives a coach and horses through the Sewell Convention about devolution, because the Welsh agreed to the various protocols and in the withdrawal agreement, rather unwillingly, but they came to an agreement after discussion. And that was one of the factors persuading the House of Lords to accept the withdrawal agreement. Now, this overrides the withdrawal agreement, but there hasn't been no consultation, let alone a legislative consent motion in the devolved bodies. So that causes problems in the relationship between Westminster and the devolved body, let alone Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, leaving that aside for the moment. In a way, that does link up with the first part of the question about our relationship with the EU. Now, the original aim of Brexit, or many of the leaders of the Brexit movement, not those who voted, but many of the leaders, was to cast Britain completely adrift from the EU, and we should become a global economic power. And the analogy often used was Singapore, but that's not a good analogy because it's an authoritarian country. A better analogy would be New Zealand and Australia, which when we joined the European communities in the 1970s, had to find new markets for themselves. And it began with New Zealand and was followed in Australia by, ironically, Labour governments. They adopted Thatcherite policies, even before Margaret Thatcher. And what they decided to do was to adopt a free market policy of reducing taxation to attract entrepreneurs to come into Britain, removing agricultural subsidies, removing tariffs, deregulating. And that caused a lot of disruption. A number of New Zealand farmers committed suicide. But New Zealand and Australia, now very prosperous countries. And in New Zealand, there are many fewer sheep in New Zealand. It's developed its own wine industry, for example. And that logically is the only point of Brexit, to establish a totally different economic regime. Now, whether it was ever possible is a moot question, and certainly the people who supported Brexit in the Northeast and elsewhere were not voting for Thatcherite economic policies. But even if it might once have been possible, and I'm a bit sceptical about that, frankly, it's not possible in the post-COVID era, which is leading governments to more state intervention, higher levels of public expenditure, and therefore much more difficult to reduce taxes, and I think simply would not be acceptable. And therefore, in a sense, the logic of Brexit, you might say, has gone, but all the same, Brexit has occurred. And in my personal opinion, this is a question of opinion, the best relationship we could have with the EU now would be the opposite of the one of the Brexit leader. It would be the closest possible relationship. Firstly, the closest relationship would minimise problems of the Northern Irish Protocol and the whole question of the Irish border. And that's been discussed a great deal. But secondly, and neither equal importance, we ought to try and get a relationship with the internal market. Now, there's been a lot of talk about a trade deal with the European Union, and I hope we get one. But even if we do, it won't make that much difference because EU tariffs are fairly low. And the main problem is being outside the internal market. For example, if you look at Turkey and the border with Bulgaria, there are huge queues of lorries, huge amount of paperwork, insurance documents, invoices, travel documents to each of the 27 countries. And if a lorry gets through in 2 hours, that's a very good day. Delays of 2 or 3 days are perfectly common. And of course, many companies, particularly small companies, won't get a cope with that. So there'll be more bankruptcies and unemployment added on to COVID. Now, the government is beginning to wake up to this, the fact that Kent may become a giant lorry park, and that there'll be huge queues at the ports here. Now, we could get round that in 2 different ways. Firstly, we could remain in the internal market as Norway is, but that involves free movement, and that's probably not acceptable. The other way would be to get in the free trade agreement, which is possible, a commitment to mutual equivalence of standards and services. Now, that isn't in any of the other EU trade agreements, to my knowledge, say with Canada, and probably less needed, but it would be with us. Now, there are 2 difficulties with that. The first one relates to something I've spoken about a few moments ago. This would require some generosity on the EU part, and that may not be much of that after the internal market bill. Secondly, the Brexiteers can say quite logically and reasonably, well, look, what's the point of leaving the EU if we're accepting the same standards and regulations, and we're continuing to have to accept them, because as soon as we have different standards and regulations, there have to be checks. And that, of course, could be the problem with the Irish Sea as well, because if goods could go across possibly to the Irish Republic with different standards and regulations, they need to be checked. The only way you can avoid a check is by us committing ourselves to the same standards and regulations. And then there has to be a dispute mechanism. And whether it's the European Court of Justice or not, it can't reach different decisions because you can't have 2 different legal regimes in the same internal market. That's fairly obvious. So you're leaving the EU, but when we were in, we had lots of opt-outs, but leaving, the ideal solution would be to get lots of opt-ins so that we actually minimize the economic disadvantage of leaving. And you can't deny it's a second best solution. My only comment would be that the other solutions of taking us further away from the EU are actually 3rd best, 4th best, and 5th best. So that might be the best possible answer, but I doubt if it's going to happen. And I fear what will happen in January is going to be very severe for many small companies.
And what to speculate a bit further, what would be the political consequences in your view of that final prospect you referred to, which I guess is what we're talking about, is a no deal end of the transition period?
Well, I think no deal would mean that we'd pay the extra tariffs on EU goods. and there'd be a need for some much greater check on the Irish border, in the Irish Sea rather. And for that's the reason why the government has threatened to override the protocol. I think there will be a deal at the last moment, though there generally is. It's better to have one than not have one. The effects of no deal would be, in my view, marginally worse, not hugely worse. But in my view, the main worry to government is beginning to wake up to, I think, is being outside the internal market. That is the crucial thing. And in other words, if you had to choose between being Turkey, which has not only a free trade deal, but is part of the customs union, but outside the internal market, or Norway, which has a tariff barriers, not in the customs union, but is inside the internal market, I'd choose Norway every day.
And that really comes back to the point you made earlier, that during the referendum campaign, I think it was a rather negative campaign by the Remain side, but one of their claims was, if we leave the EU, we're going to end up like Norway. That was one of the main things thrown against.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that prophecy would have come true.
Yes, and the problem with Norway, which the Remainers emphasised, was that you were a member of the EU, but you weren't, in effect, represented there, so that it's customary for EU laws to be transmitted to Norway for comments. But Norway is known as a fax democracy because no one ever takes any notes of the comments because they're not represented there. They've got regulation without representation. And so it's the second best. But the other solutions, in my view, are even worse, given that COVID has occurred. As I say, if COVID hadn't occurred, there might have been a possibility of the kind of Thatcherite global Britain that some of the leaders of the Brexit campaign would have liked to see. And it's fair to say, if you'd reduced taxes radically, you would have attracted entrepreneurs here. And if you've got the right degree of market response, you might have brought prosperity. This would also require what the government's again really getting down to after many years on the part of both governments in neglect. You need better skills education because after all, there'll be a lot of disruption in the market. You're moving to a market economy. Logically, there's something to be said for it. Politically, it's now almost impossible to envisage.
And really, my final question I'd like to put is that in the UK, and even before the UK was the UK, disagree, and you pointed out Shakespeare and the island and those kind of things, disagreements about what should be our proper relationship with Europe, how engaged we should be. You're right to say there's been this kind of skeptical tendency. There's also been disagreement, those who think we should engage more and those who think we should engage less. And it goes back in many different ways. Is there any reason to suppose that that kind of argument is actually going to go away, whether we're in or out? And is it even going to go away within the Conservative Party?
No, I think it won't go away. You're right. It'll go on for many years. And someone said of devolution, it was a process, not an event. And that's even more true of Brexit. I think there'll be endless negotiations about trade, tariffs, market regulations, and so on. You can't escape from that. There will be much influence. Can't help being influenced by what happens in the European Union. Then another factor, which is discussed in the book, which I haven't mentioned, defence cooperation. If Europe's to be a power, that must involve Britain. And here I think the French are to blame because they see Brexit as purely in terms of economic benefit for themselves. They don't see the need geopolitically to bring Britain into Europe in defence terms. So I think this is an argument which will run and run and run.
Okay, well, on that, I think people watching this will realise that they really need to go away and read your book. So it's called Britain and Europe in a Troubled World. It's out now, Yale University Press. I'll be circulating to my students and other viewers a code so that they can actually get a discount on it. You'll be pleased to hear. But even at full price, it's very much.
When the COVID crisis is over, I'll be happy to talk to students about it.
Yeah, and when do you think that will be over? Since we're talking,
your guess is as good as mine, really.
Okay, Professor Vernon Bogdanor, it's been a real pleasure to have you here again, and we do look forward to having you again, either via Zoom or even better in person. Thank you very much.